at the risk of pulling stereotypes, two-channel is often a little bit of a more solo experience
Mm.
compared to home cinema.
Yes, no argument there. We
Yeah,
very rarely have rows of seating for your two-channel hi-fi speakers.
exactly. Exactly. And that's really where the big sort of difference comes when you're trying to do a bass system for a cinema. The consistency across the entire listening area is one of the most critical factors, because it's really true that you can have a middle seat that sounds great, and if you're not careful, the literal next seat can have a huge suck out right through the main bass region. That happens all the time.
Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Phil Hinton, I'm the site editor, and joining me on this video is our hi-fi editor, Ed Selley. Hi, Ed.
Hello, sir.
And also from SRND Group, we got Neil Davidson. Hi, Neil.
Hi, Phil. How you getting on?
Very good. Right, so today we're talking about subwoofers. We're not just talking about subwoofers for home AV though, or home theatre. We're also talking about two-channel. Can you use a subwoofer? Should you use a subwoofer? It's one of these age-old arguments that's been going on, well, definitely the 20-odd years I've been in the hobby and doing this professionally and so on. Subwoofers, how many should you have? Should you have them with two-channel and all the rest of it? But I think we need to go to the basics. And to explain our panel, Neil Davidson from SRND Group. Neil's been around a very long time. Business to business mainly in terms of custom installation. He builds everything from mega £1,000,000 DCI home cinemas all the way down to not mega millions of pounds, but still pretty tasty home cinema stuff. Neil's also knows his thing, a thing or two about audio and so on. He has lots of things to measure, lots of audio characteristics and so on. So he's also I'm going to say expert, Neil, in room acoustics and putting rooms together and making them sound good. And of course, the worst speaker to try and put in any room is a sub-bass speaker. So Neil has quite a bit of knowledge there. And also on the podcast is obviously our hi-fi editor, Ed Selley, lives in the world of two-channel, and rightly so. It's a fantastic world to live in. Does he have strong opinions and strong views when it comes to subwoofers? We're going to find out all of that in this edition. But first of all, what is a subwoofer, Neil?
Well, subwoofer is a good question. Subwoofer is a speaker that's intended to add some low-end extension into your system. It's really dedicated to the low frequencies. Let's say 150 hertz down, although people will always try to play it a little bit lower than that. That's the job of the subwoofer, is to give that low-end emphasis in the system.
Oh, we've lost you.
I need to unmute. So, Ed, why do you think there has been in the past this strong pushback from the hi-fi community when you're talking about subwoofers and sub-bass?
Well, there's two reasons. One is vaguely legitimate, and the other one is reactionary, I suppose, with the best will in the world. As was hinted at, actually getting subwoofers to behave themselves in an optimal fashion in room is more involved than can be the case with most other loudspeakers. When you took into account that the toolkit available to two-channel audio in a traditional basis was rather smaller than it was for AV about getting subwoofers to work, a number of people were simply not keen on the idea because, bluntly speaking, the means of actually getting a 2.1 system or 2.2 system to do what it was technically capable of doing in a reliable and enjoyable way was a little bit hit and miss. Now, within this as well, subwoofers essentially the place where they've always sold strongly, historically, has been in an AV sense. And as I'm sure we'll cover in a little bit about this, so whilst you can in 2025 you can coax extremely good results out of almost any subwoofer if you throw a little bit of processing at it, if you're looking at this in a more traditionalist sense, some of the design functionality and features that optimize AV performance, where you have a dedicated LFE channel and so on and so forth, do not necessarily transfer to being completely successful when you're not sending it a dedicated signal, when there's an element of handed over crossover and so on and so forth. They're not insurmountable issues, but it's led to, if you like, a little bit of reluctance. If you've heard enough bad 2.1 systems, you aren't necessarily going to fall over yourself to have your own one of those. And for a long period of time, some of the hardware just simply didn't necessarily play nice with two-channel audio in a way that encouraged you to want to try.
So Neil, let's get back to home theater, because this is where people know the subwoofer from. You just have to look at probably the last 30 or 40 years when it comes to home cinema. You're looking at ProLogic days, you're looking at moving into digital audio eventually, and then immersive audio and so on. The subwoofer certainly been a speaker that has gone through all of those phases, because for home theater, the easiest way to get 5 speakers in a room was to make sure that the speakers were small and then have a box that took the lower frequencies and did all that. And the reason why that works is obviously because bass energy is not directional under certain frequencies. So with that in mind, give us a little bit of potted history on the subwoofer in terms of 5.1 and where we are now with 5. Well, you actually add in the height channels as well now. So
28.28.
yeah,
That's what you're looking
it's
for, Phil.
quite a bit. So maybe just give us a quick potted history of the subwoofer before we go into the more interesting bits.
Well, so I mean, you picked it up there. I think that the subwoofer did start off gaining its popularity in the home AV sense, definitely with those 5.1 systems. And I was thinking, what a long time you've said there. But then I remember selling those things back in Curry's in the late 90s and was agonized. Maybe you saw that on my face when I was thinking about it. That was when that came, and interesting. I wonder how many of us would still welcome a really nice little subsat system instead of all the sound bars and stuff like that as a good option these days. Now, when you start to move into more channels, naturally, the bigger the speaker, the more challenging the aesthetic integration comes. And that was really the benefit of a subwoofer. It was sold as a box that you could kind of kick it into the corner that you don't see it, hide it behind the sofa. You won't see it, and then you've got these little speakers. Now, the problem with that is that one subwoofer in a room is an extremely challenging thing to make work well at more than one position. And I'm sure we'll come on to these technicalities of it. Now, over the years, what we've done is we've kind of looked to see how sound can be improved. Subwoofer well integrated will definitely do that. People appreciate bass, so more good bass is pretty much always a good thing. So what we saw was that systems moved to using multiple subwoofers, and the benefit of multiple subwoofers is that they can mitigate some of the standing waves, room resonances is the term I use, that you find in a room at low frequencies, which are all related to the dimensions of the room and where people are within the space. Now, lots of studies and lots of very cool stuff that's gone into that. What you will typically find is that 2 subwoofers works pretty okay for a sofa. If you've got rows of seats or you're just wanting a bit more, 4 subwoofers for the longest time was kind of an optimal number. Now, of course, there was a fairly rapid change, and it's one of those ones that I find very interesting. So 4 subwoofers work brilliantly well, and I have all the data to show me how well 4 subwoofers can be integrated into a system. But all of a sudden, I'm sure people on the forums are going, oh, but so-and-so has like literally 18 subwoofers in his room and 8 at the front and 10 at the back and all of this type of stuff. Well, what brought that about was actually Trinov's waveforming technology. And waveforming really made it more simple to integrate more subwoofers. Now, there are lots of interesting bits of maths about that and all those types of things. Of course there are. It's probably an interesting debate. What's the benefit of going from 4 to 18 or 12 or whatever else? You know, it's not like it's a small jump that you go through when you move up into these things. And it's something that I have to say I personally struggle with, because I know how well 4 subwoofers can work. I could go mad, I could put 5 in and I could do a super low bass subwoofer. But that's what you're starting to see now. And we're even starting to see bass managed sub-bass systems, which seems utterly crazy to me. But again, that's something that you're starting to see, where you have, people will be familiar now, I think, infra-bass is this new topic that suddenly seemed to appear. That's the very, very low end. Let's try and define that as the space below the lowest room resonance would be the infra-bass region, and then crossed over and then kick bass and all of those types of things as you move up through the range. It's all very, very interesting to see all of those types of things. But for me personally, I would caution, if you can get 2 subwoofers, you can still do a tremendous job. 4 subwoofers in the right hands will always do pretty much as good a job as these crazy things. So you don't need to think about building your theatre in subwoofers these days. But that's kind of where we're almost approaching. Especially in the US, you'll see a lot of these things with just unbelievable quantities of subwoofers in them.
And of course, I don't want to get cliched here, but because we mention this on every discussion we have for audio, but the room is important. And of course, if you're talking about that many subwoofers, we're talking about quite a big space to fill. And this is the next point that we're coming on to, which is basically, how do we make a subwoofer work optimally? And the first thing we need to think about, obviously there, Neil and Ed, is the space in which you're going to use that speaker and what you want it to do in terms of playback.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, Neil can do his complicated one. From my perspective, ultimately, we haven't got more than 2 speakers, non-sub-bass transducers, to concern ourselves with. I mean, I'm aware and have experienced, I mean, obviously at the Bristol show recently, we had a 2.6 system in a technical sense of the word. I mean, obviously the 3 subs on each side were essentially arranged on axis. They weren't being instructed to do significantly different things. They weren't being told to do the same thing. Unless you've got some really interesting requirements and a very large room indeed, from my perspective, 2.2 is about as far as you are really going to want to take 2-channel audio for all but the most sort of specialist requirements. And essentially, because there are only 2 speakers in the room, you are looking at the mechanics of the relationship of however many subwoofers you choose, be it 1, 2, or more, to those 2 speakers. It's not the same is Neil is creating a sound field and is having many channels of information to do that. I've got 2 and I simply want to augment those 2. So broadly speaking, with some provisos, staying on axis and doing your best to essentially identify the relationship between a channel and its attendant subwoofer is going to get you quite a long way in 2-channel. But for multi-channel, I suspect it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Well, it's an interesting point, Sid. So one of the things that we've got to consider is when you talk about sub-bass, and all sound basically is a sound wave. And bass has just got such long wavelengths. I don't think people can imagine how long the wavelengths of bass notes are. You know, you're talking 20, 30 meters long waves, some of these things. Now, those waves are so long that clearly they are massively longer than the rooms that we are in. And you can have all sorts of debates about timings and all of those types of stuff, but you are effectively in the sound at those low frequencies because the waves are so long. Now, what that means is that in the sub-bass region, in terms of consistency, the room almost dominates everything. It's really a spatial relationship between the speaker, the listener, and the room dimensions that dominates everything when it comes to sub bass. Now, where that gets very interesting, of course, and where, in fact, cinema and two-channel, if we can say that, perhaps diverge. At the risk of pulling stereotypes, two-channel is often a little bit of a more solo experience compared to home cinema.
Yes, no argument there.
Yeah.
We very rarely have rows of seating for your two-channel hi-fi.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's really where the big sort of difference comes when you're trying to do a bass system for a cinema. The consistency across the entire listening area is one of the most critical factors, because it's really true that you can have a middle seat that sounds great, and if you're not careful, the literal next seat can have a huge suck out right through the main bass region. That happens all the time.
Yeah.
In a 2.4 meter high room, which guess what is a lot of them, the height axis often has a suck out around 80 hertz. Wow, that's really annoying for people who know how to do these things. That's something that happens all the time. Whereas what Ed was saying, in a two-channel system, often the cohesion between the handoff from the main speaker to the subwoofer, it can be more interesting to focus on the sort of location. What's the word I'm looking for there? The consistency between those things across your whole soundstage, as opposed to trying to. There is a point, unless you've got very large speakers, that you've got like a transition zone.
Yes.
You go from the main speaker to the subwoofer, and then your localization. And you've always got to be careful not to have a spread just in that low upper bass, let's call it, region. So that's where you kind of get those differences between the setup between a cinema and a two-channel system. Ultimately, it's the same goal. It's to get good kick and cohesion, but a little bit different approach normally.
So it's all about your room. I say this every time, and the kit that you're using and your end goal. Now let's focus on hi-fi, and then we'll get to millions of subwoofers in a cinema and the difficulties there, because that's where the difficulties really are. So I think the guys have explained it really quite well here. So I guess the first point that we're going to say to people in terms of using a subwoofer for two-channel, you can get away with using one subwoofer in a two-channel system, depending on the size of the room. But if we take an average living room size in the UK, you can generally get away with that. The main thing you need to be concentrating on, as Neil says, is your crossover point, making sure that is you can close your eyes and you can't localize where the bass is coming from. It's probably the best way.
You need to be careful with your setup on one. It's actually, ironically, can be more difficult to set one up really well than two.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you can get away with it, absolutely.
Yeah. And where things can help, and I've had this problem in the room that I'm in at the minute, is I only have room for one subwoofer really, in a couple of locations, but only one subwoofer really in the way that this room is being used. The biggest help was actually Dirac, or even Odyssey can do a pretty good job of handling the crossover point, and that handoff, because this is where measurements and taking those measurements and applying a filter will do a lot of good. As long as you've done the basics right, which we've covered in the last conversation we had on EQ, as long as you've got a fairly good starting point, it's fairly easy for the software then to put that filter in place and so on. Like Neil says, it's difficult with one subwoofer, but if you manage to get it well positioned and use a little bit of EQ, usually you can't tell you got a subwoofer in the room. You think you've got full range speakers, and that's what you're aiming for at the end of the day, isn't it, Ed? Because what you don't want is this juxtaposition or this handoff between your great speakers on your stands and then the bass suddenly coming in. And
we weren't having a discussion about full range speakers versus crossovers. Don't get yourself on a different tangent here.
That's all fun and games in itself. And then just to add an extra layer of faff to this, in a two-channel sense, a lot of the crossover points that we're talking about are between, let's say, for the sake of argument, 49 and 31 hertz. Generally speaking, if your speakers go lower than that, you probably aren't going to be looking at a sub. And higher than that, the chances are that there's different solutions going on anyway. In a number of UK rooms, my own listening room included, that is also at a point where a room node is kicking in as well. So you've got the business of handing over seamlessly at exactly the same point where the frequency responses of both objects are being artificially augmented. This means if you're doing it in a purely analog sense, you have bought a subwoofer with a manual crossover on the back of it, and you are essentially looking at your speaker's measured frequency response. If you just do it on, well, it says it goes down to that, bosh, so on and so forth. The chances are, unfortunately, fate is going to just vomit on your eider down, because the chances are the room has got some strong sayings on that. If you look at most of the speaker reviews I've done over the last, certainly since I moved into this house, almost every single speaker I've tested has bettered its claimed in-room response, because my room very gently, it must be said quite benignly, just gives it that little goose at the bottom. So we've had this conversation come up before. If you really want to make a decent go of this, even if you are not using a Dirac or system where it's got subwoofer management in the amplifier itself, for goodness sake, measure the room, please. Whatever you might get cross about spending a little bit of outlay on doing that measurement, you will more than save it at whatever hourly rate you think you're paid, because essentially the on-paper measurement of where you think you're crossing over will almost certainly be incorrect, because the room will be enhancing that point. So once you've done that, if you can measure the room, requirements for 2-channel subs and multi-channel subs, there's a subtle difference in so much as best as I understand it when I dip into the multi-channel reviews, subwoofers these days can be essentially headless. The processor / AV receiver or similar is going to do almost every single form of instruction they just need to be a socking great amplifier, a socking great driver in the most robust cabinet you can get together. 2-channel subwoofers can also follow that path. If you are a Dirac user or Trinov user, not Trinov, Lingdorf, so on and so forth, where there's excellent bass management on board, the subwoofer doesn't need to have much or anything in the way of adjustment itself. It can be electronically allocated. In a more trad 2-channel system, adjustment is very, very useful. Crossover and volume. I'm tempted to say that a phase control, which is not a simple phase switch, but is a fully variable 0 to 180 degree phase control, will help you. But again, setting phase by ear is a dark art. Again, it's something that you would want to measure if you are having phase issues. You can minimize phase issues. As Neil says, the bass frequency is always going to be longer, but you can at least get a bit of a head start on phase adjustment by having the speaker on axis with the subwoofer in roughly the same place and where it needs to be. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to help you begin. So you look at some of the subwoofers that we've seen on the site and we see elsewhere, they're either extremely clever and they've got lots of EQ functionality of their own, or they are stripped back bare minimal. Companies that produce things that are more 2-channel oriented, and the two that really stand out for me on this is Rel of British hi-fi fame and Eclipse, the Japanese manufacturer, who builds some very specialist subwoofers to partner their single driver subwoofers, single driver loudspeakers, I should say. Those have got some they've got some useful bells and whistles in terms of integrating in a world free from DSP. If you do have DSP and Dirac, you can essentially, the world is your oyster. You will get almost anything to behave itself. Just don't, standard rules, don't buy something which is going to overload your room. But, if you're looking for something where you are going to be doing all the adjustments on the back of the subwoofer, make sure that you have the means of doing those adjustments.
Now, you probably just scared quite a few people, Ed, by mentioning measurement and so on. It's one of these things that people suddenly think, well, that's too much time and I need to learn something new and so on. But actually, and I'll come to Neil, because Neil measures things on a very regular basis and could probably tell you off the top of his head if you give him room dimensions where issues will be. It's not that difficult, is it, Neil? You just need to get your head around a few things and you don't spend a lot of money, because REW software is free. which you can get online, nice and easy.
Yeah.
I'm going to do some show and tell. A mini DSP mic like this. I think I paid £90 for this. Neil's probably got one as well. It's the what's the name of it again? It is the Neil's going to correct me on this one. It hasn't got the name on it, but you'll find that anywhere online. And
Yeah.
90 quid, it's well worth spending the money.
That's how you make one.
That's the one.
That's how you make one.
Yeah. And it's industry standard now. Everybody uses that thing. And like I say, dead easy to get one. The software is free. Take a couple of evenings, read the forums. There's lots of great threads on the forums explaining that, and that hopefully gets you over that hurdle. And then, Neil, the world's really your oyster, because once you can measure using your kit and your speakers in your location in your room, then you can start to build up a picture of how to integrate your subwoofer and get the best possible performance.
Well, you actually said something before that. So one of the tools that is woefully underutilized is a model up front. Now, bass problems in rooms are pretty much linked to how big the room is in each dimension. So you can do that modeling. My own website, Cinema Tools, has that. Room EQ Wizard has an excellent modeling tool where you can you put in the room dimensions and you can set the speaker and listener locations, and it will model the expected response for that. And that's actually probably that's where I would start with if people download the Room EQ Wizard, just to do the modeling part of things, because it's uncannily accurate, I have to tell you, at those low frequencies. Now, then when you get on to the measurement part of things, people tend to freak out with the Room EQ Wizard about how complicated the interface looks like and all of that type of stuff. But there's no getting around it. It's not the ultimate in ultra user friendliness, mainly because of what it's trying to do, as opposed to the amazing design work that John Mulcahy did over all these years of giving us this amazing tools to use for free. It is worth learning how to do it, because the combination of the model and the combination of being able to do a few little things, like Ed was talking about phase there. Phase used to be horrible. 2 degrees, measure, 2 degrees, measure, 2 degrees, measure. You'd be there for months. It was painful. In the Room EQ Wizard now, you can do 2 measurements, put in a beautiful thing that says match phase at cursor, and it does all of its amazing maths for you. You just do it. It has been transformative because it has been updated so much over the years. I cannot say enough if people would donate to the Room EQ Wizard, because any competing software is going to be £2,000 or £3,000. Compared to that, it's the most unbelievable bargain in audio, that gets given away for free.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, so that's the approach if you want to go that far, or you, like we said earlier, just make sure the room is nicely put together as much as possible, and then use some EQ. There's plenty of great EQ out there that all works as well when it comes to bass. We have also mentioned trends, so there are some trends that really are changing the way that we look at subwoofers and so on. And you mentioned what Trinov are doing, Neil, and there are some other examples or recommendations out there. So in the professional world, where are things at the minute?
Well, actually, it's really interesting. So if you look at the really professional world in studios, every studio is getting converted at this minute in time to being a 714 Atmos studio, which is very interesting to me how they still do it with 0.1. And there's lots of very interesting and weird to me white papers about how people try to optimize with one subwoofer and are amazed to find that room issues dominate. I've seen quite a few of those types of papers lately, and it's like, I mean, this is not new stuff, guys. This has been going on for a long time, this whole issue of sub bass, So ironically, what a lot of guys are doing in their homes are way, way, way ahead of what the professional studios are doing. I think there's one thing in trends though that before we dive too far into that, one thing that we've not spoken about yet is there are really 3 types of subwoofers, okay? You've got sealed subwoofers, ported subwoofers, and then subwoofers with a passive radiator, okay? Now, it used to be that you would take a ported subwoofer. Now, the benefit of a ported subwoofer is it's very easy in relative terms to drive that to the port tuning frequency, but then the performance just falls off like a stone at the port tuning frequency. But now you're starting to see a lot more interest in, do I combine a sealed subwoofer? So a sealed subwoofer in some ways is more difficult to drive. The cabinet pressure needs to be overcome by power, basically. But the group delay, the timing is much better from a sealed subwoofer compared to a ported subwoofer. It's just physics and how they work. So it used to be that you would say, okay, if I take a sealed sub, I'll get that hertz, and it will sound amazing, but is that enough? And that's typically where this whole discussion about ported subwoofers would come from. Well, in our world, we have all of these insane sealed 21-inch subs and all that type of stuff these days, with impulse responses like you can't even imagine. I saw one at ISE that was made of pure carbon fiber, and it truly astonished me how light that cone was. And it was 21 inches in diameter. That thing, it just blew my mind. Put 3,000 watts into it and it'll eat it up all day long, you know. That'll make your insides shake. Now, then you've got the funny one in the middle with the passive radiator. So passive radiator is when you've got a sub and it looks like it's got like 1 or 2 extra drivers on it. And basically they're in between ported and sealed. The movement of those things on the side makes it easier for the actual main driver to drive. They all have slightly different behavior, so it's probably not the forum to go into that. For me, if you're looking at a 2-channel system, a really nice sealed subwoofer is going to be hard to beat from a timing perspective.
100%. And it's interesting, even when you deal with notionally hi-fi optimized things with radiators on, just you can measure what the radiator's doing, and depending on which direction the radiator is pointing in, especially if I mean, you know, let's face it, you can have an argument for hours over the threshold of omnidirectionality, but if the radiator is operating at points above that of omnidirectionality, you just end up with some strange behavior. And it's not necessarily something that I would fall over myself to get involved in. I mean, something oddly I've always found worked relatively well in a 2-channel sense was counter-firing active drivers. So one on either side of the cabinet. In a benign room where it was centrally placed between the 2 stereo loudspeakers, the end result there, even though the actual bass drivers were not pointing in the same direction as the drivers themselves, with a little bit of care in phase, that ended up doing some quite impressive things. But weirdly, that is a configuration that I think has become less popular in the last 10 years.
That's a symmetric drive woofer. And there is one company that people will have heard of that really are good at that, and that's Sonos, because that's how Sonos subwoofers all work, with a symmetric drive woofer.
Yeah.
And in audio also do a lot of that stuff still.
It's still something that I rate very highly, certainly for a 2.1 setup. You know, so long as you do have a degree of free placement in where the subwoofer will go, I've had some good results with that. So it's, you know, if the options are there, it's something to consider.
I think that one, because you're exactly right, you get a cancellation, a mechanical cancellation. These 2 big things wobbling, they counterbalance each other.
Yeah.
The reason I think that's fallen a little bit out of favor is nothing to do with its technical merit. It's a physical challenge, because almost by definition, you've got to have the drivers on the side.
Yeah.
So the thing is the depth of the drivers.
Yes.
Diameter, as opposed to however your voice coil is. And honestly, that's the biggest challenge of that. There is some cool new technology that we've seen recently. Subwoofers that have got a single voice coil driving two independent drivers
Oh, okay.
do that, which is quite interesting. So I've seen some
But do
cool
you
stuff.
remember the old Boas PV1? You know, the ball. I mean,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
was always. I mean, always. I mean, you sort of discard it as a sort of lifestyle trinket, but it was actually very capable if
sure.
you used it with any degree of mechanical sympathy, which most people didn't. So yeah, things like that. You know, I was always quite impressed with items along those lines, and it's good to know that actually there is at least still some development in that potential, because I think it can be made to work extremely well.
Well, I think it does, but um, that whole thing, because it's all about your area, so it had a big
Mm,
advantage in area and all that type of stuff as well. So now what you see is that area moves to these big massive drivers
yeah.
that we're talking about. So what changed a lot for the design capabilities that we can do? It used to be you really had to use a ported to get the low frequency extension, but now we have access to such large drivers that can take so much power. We can actually do sealed subwoofers that genuinely play to 25 hertz.
Mm,
Now, the advantage of that is if you look at an anechoic measurement of a subwoofer that plays to 25 hertz, when you put that in a room, that's below the lowest resonant frequency, and it all gets
yeah.
very mathy here. Um, with a sealed subwoofer compared to a ported subwoofer, because of the way room gain works, that actually all of a sudden your room gain balances out the roll off. So you get a very, very flat response way deep down, much lower than the sealed subwoofer's spec
Yeah.
would make you think. And retaining all that quickness and everything. So what we are really trying to do is use big sealed subwoofers and drive them as hard as we can to get that quick response as far down into the frequency range as possible these days.
Yeah.
Got to have a big room to fit
Well, I
all
mean, you
this
know,
stuff with
this
toys,
is
though.
unfortunately money talks in so many different ways, isn't it? But yes.
So, right, let's get it back to the real basics thing, because we could really deep dive into this, and that's not really the point. The point of this is to try and give the best advice we can to people who are maybe introducing subwoofer for the first time, a two-channel system, or they want to get more out of their home theater system, home cinema system, and so on. So, Ed, first of all, what's your advice to people out there? They've got a nice two-channel system at the minute, but they feel like they're just missing that little bit of kick at the bottom end, or they just want to fill in the sound a little bit. What's your advice to them? What route are you going to put them on?
First of all, when they say they're missing that last bit of low end, they need to be honest with themselves. How low is that low end that they're missing? Because, like so many aspects of messing with physics, if let's say you've got a small pair of stand mount speakers and you've got minimal energy below 50 hertz, that's not a particularly complicated thing to augment in a nice, organized way. If you've got a socking great pair of floor standers and you feel that those are still not delivering the sort of spleen loosening effect that you really, really want. So let's say that for the sake of argument, you're going down 20 hertz lower on a pair of loudspeakers and you want to fill in that space below that. It's a substantially more complicated and expensive process to fill that in. So it's worth being, if you feel that your floor standers in room are not delivering sufficient bass, yeah, just have a think about how much you want to spend to sort that, because it's going to to just add more noise isn't that expensive. To add decent high quality fill in below 30 hertz is an expensive business. 50 hertz, that's something where you could look at a single subwoofer. I agree with Neil that if you can, a single sealed box design, ideally with a driver in it, would be a way to start looking. And there's plenty of manufacturers that turn out those items. If again, you can then to add to this, that's you don't mind it potentially being visible and on axis with your loudspeakers. if you can follow the instructions about measuring the room and checking where you would hand over the crossover, it would be a case of buying one of those, making sure that you have an output on your amplifier, either a pre-out dedicated subwoofer out. Generally speaking, on most stereo amplifiers, there isn't actually a difference. They don't have any particular management. It's just whether they've got one or two of them. Or if you're feeling really, really trad, you can look at various high-level speaker outputs, which, you know, some manufacturers get very excited about. I've never been particularly bowled over by the differences that result from that. And then it's a question of spending a careful afternoon or two just getting it dialed in. If you wanted to add something that went from 49 hertz to, I don't know, 25, £1,000 as a rule of thumb, £1,000 would probably sort you a solution that could do that pretty damn well. And if you really wanted to make a go of it, if you then started looking at devices like the Blue Sound Node Icon that we've recently tested, or even the WIM products with their own, you know, tweakable EQ, you can then use measurements to then just make a better job of dialing that subwoofer in. If you're looking for something to fill in below 30 hertz to, I don't know, threshold of your audibility, think of a number and make it larger. And then also make sure the room is pretty large to start with, because the box in question, Neil's talking about 20-inch drivers. Yeah. I mean, you know, serious, clean, non-distortion, low-end energy requires a substantial amount of horsepower and scale to achieve. And depending on what music you listen to, I genuinely would recommend going to listen to an implemented system before you decide whether it's worth the effort. If you're an organ music fan, and I'm not being derogatory here, there are plenty of organ music fans, it becomes something that's worth doing, because something that actually replicates something which fills churches, to actually get that visceral sense is worth the effort. If you're listening to something which moves a bit faster than organ music, then it starts getting a bit complicated. You may find you've got clean extra extension, but just transient speed. We're incredibly sensitive to transient speed, and things that move like the clappers that are very large tend to be very expensive. And you may find that the loss of transient speed more than outweighs any gain that you get in your perceived bass response. So once you start looking at spending a lot of money, same with so many things, go to a dealer that knows what they're talking about and get a bloody good listen, because you may find even the well-implemented solution is not for you. But if you're filling in a pair of stand mount loudspeakers, there's no reason why it need be astronomically expensive, and the end result should be quite satisfying to listen to.
Well, the other argument there, or not an argument, but the other solution there, Ed, sometimes, and certainly, I know quite a few people who have gone down this road, enthusiasts, hi-fi enthusiasts and so on, they've gone and gotten the, you know, the floor standing speakers that they've always pined after
Yes.
and so on, and hated the sound in their space because they couldn't give their speaker enough room to breathe and do what it needed to do in that
Yes.
space to get that kind of response. And they reverted back to stand mounts, high quality stand mounts, but then with some sub bass implementation.
That's, I mean, often that is, I mean, you know, I've tested speakers in this room for AVForums and other sites where I have been pushing the physical limitations of the room. And, you know, thankfully, I have enough understanding of the room and enough understanding of, you know, a few other things to be able to listen through that. But yeah, the idea of spending £10,000-12,000 and, you know, essentially having a gently hobbled performance is not desperately appealing. I mean, it's an expensive solution to say to someone, if you want more bass, move house. But I mean, depending on how far you want to push this, it's not necessarily an unreasonable one. So yes, and then the last, I suppose there's one last non-subwoofer based wild card on this. If you are, I mean, this applies to so many things. If you really are up against it with LFE and things like that, don't forget that if we switch to the world of the very small, a pair of very well sorted, good quality, open backed dynamic driver headphones, most of those are ruler flat to 20 hertz, and some of them are ruler flat to quite a long way below 20 hertz. So if the listening experience is extremely lonely and it's just you, and you really want bass and good, clean, really top-notch bass, headphone people have been smiling to themselves and enjoying this for decades, because essentially you change the rules of physics because you change the listening space and the listening distances, and those people are experiencing a linearity of low end response that most of us in room can only dream of.
Excellent. That's a great summary, Ed. Thank you very much for that wrap up on the hi-fi. So Neil, home theatre. Now, let's just say that somebody's got a reasonable budget, a realistic budget. We're talking about, a lot of forum members out there. They want to improve the bass performance of their home cinema. It is an often asked question. People do have issues with it. What's your advice to them?
Well, I think that when you're starting to look at a room above, sound bars and stuff like that, where someone has gone out and they've bought a pretty nice set of speakers, 7.x.4, that's someone who's already made quite a big commitment. They've probably got a nice processor or an AVR. They're into that for maybe 5 figures already, a room like that. Now, I think that to really expand on a room like that, it's not something that you're going to do for, a couple of £1,000. You got to be thinking £3,000-4,000 to give the shove that you're looking for as a minimum. But that's mainly because I'm talking about doing it with at least 2 subwoofers, ideally 4 subwoofers in a space like that. Really, because of the difference, as we said, it's all about spatial. However, anyone who's spending that sort of money would be well set to get some really good advice and support in the setup of that thing. If they're upgrading an existing theatre, hopefully they've maybe worked with someone before, or on the forums, they're going to get advice on where those things can be laid out. If it's a new build theatre, that's just a matter of course that those things should be designed properly to work in those situations. The reason of that cost, it's not really down to beautiful cabinet finishes and all of those types of things. If you're going to take a box and you're going to make that play to 100 plus decibels at 20 hertz, it's actually very, very, very difficult, I can tell you. Even if you accept 25 hertz, you will save yourself quite a bit of money. You need powerful amplification. You're going to have some DSP. There's just a lot goes into it to deliver that next level, if you like. So it's not something to be undertaken too lightly. If you're in the hobby, it's probably one of the most interesting bits of the hobby, though, to get into.
Excellent. Well, there you go. Hopefully we've answered some questions there and pointed you in the right direction. Of course, head over to the forums. There's lots and lots of experience over on the forums. Lots of people building systems, probably like the ones that you're thinking about. So head over there, see what other people are doing. And again, just think about the basics as we always do. And I know it sounds cliched every time we see it, but get the basics right, and then everything else should follow after that, and it should be a bit simpler, whether you're putting together 2-channel or a home theatre. You'll notice that I've separated these camps out because I think an interesting discussion is for another day, and that is, can hi-fi be home theatre and home theatre be hi-fi using subwoofers? Is it does that is like a whole new conversation, which we're not going to go into today. That's it for today. But if you have got any questions, then do put them in the comments section. We do read them, we do take them on board, and if you're asking us questions and so on that we can then answer in future podcasts, we will absolutely do that. So please do put your comments there, whether that's on YouTube or on AVForums in the podcast forum underneath this podcast. Then please do that. So my thanks to Neil Davidson and of course Ed Selley. Join us in another video. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon. Goodbye.